locals from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I often feel strange with the land acknowledgement because I always find that I'm standing in a building and sort of touching these sort of carpets and fake wooden pieces of furniture, so I don't know quite where the land is in all of that. And I was thinking about that, and it kind of reminded me that even though the land is often what we think of as earth and trees and water and fish and sky, that also, even though we're not maybe feeling that directly, the land is what's allowing us to have this space here to interact with each other. So I like thinking about the land in that way, and thinking of it too as an opportunity to recognize that the acknowledgement is obviously never enough, but at least it gives us the opportunity to reflect on that necessary moment of gratitude. So those are some thoughts that I had about that. I want to begin also by thanking the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada for making this event possible. Of course, the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, and certainly a huge thanks to the Center for Global Disability Studies, particularly to Cassandra Hartley. In Spanish and Portuguese, a huge thanks to Berenice Villagomez for publicity support, and of course to Salvador Alanis and Rodrigo Vite Mendoza for tech support and other support, and thanks to all of you for being here. We do have accessible washrooms located just out here, just straight behind you and to the right as you look outside.
That's nice.
Useful, yeah. Right, that is something that I like about this building. We have live captioning that's happening, and thanks to our captioner for being so patient and getting our setup going. Happy about that. This event is part of a larger initiative funded by SSHRC called Eugenic Legacies in Mexico and the Americas, which relates to our work in disability studies and in the history and ongoing discussions of eugenics in various ways. But it's also part of a longer-term collaboration and engagement with the 17 Institute, of which Benjamín is the director, and Beatriz is the director of the Disability Studies program within that. And we were just reflecting the other day that I think we've been sort of in various forms of collaboration for more than 10 years now, so somehow it's gone by quickly, and it's been really a great privilege to have the opportunity to work with both Benjamín and Beatriz on different projects, conferences, all kinds of initiatives. Also our Eugenic Legacies project that's still in progress. Great, so our event today is in two parts, right? So the first presentation will be sort of a joint presentation with both Benjamín and Beatriz, right? And then we will have some time for Q&A and a little discussion, a short break, and then followed by the second presentation by Beatriz. So I'm going to first introduce our speakers, and then after that we'll get underway with the blind photographer illuminates. So Benjamín Foulkes has practiced psychoanalysis in Mexico City for the past 25 years. He's the founding director of the 17 Institute of Critical Studies. He received his PhD in philosophy from the National University of Mexico, among other degrees. He's also international expert on blind photography and a co-founder of Sentire, the Mexican ensemble that brings together musicians and deaf actors. He's lectured at many universities in Latin America, North America, and Europe. And also he's a close collaborator of the Institute for Critical Studies in Improvisation at the University of Guelph, and currently an O'Gorman Senior Research Associate at Columbia University. So we were excited to steal him away from New York for at least a brief visit while he was doing that. Beatriz Miranda Galarza is an Ecuadorian sociologist and anthropologist, but living currently in Mexico City. She holds a PhD in disability studies from Leeds University in England, among other degrees, and has 30 years of experience in social and community research linked to disability and health. Since 2019, she's been working with judges and lawyers at the Mexican Supreme Court in Mexico on issues regarding disability rights and social research. She's also the coordinator of the Critical Disability Studies program at the 17 Institute of Critical Studies. And her book is titled Nuestra Historia No Es Mentira, Vivir con Lepra en Ecuador, or Our History or Our Story is No Lie, Living with Leprosy in Ecuador. She's also co-edited a volume and preparing currently a book about the history of the disability movement in Mexico. So again, thank you all so much for being here, and please join me in welcoming Beatriz.
Well, thank you all so much. Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you to everyone who made this meeting possible, both persons and institutions. I want to join the big thank yous that Susan so well gave. It's really wonderful to be here. We've had a growing dialogue with Canada for a number of years, and we've found it really rich and really dynamic, very easy establishing connections, and we could perhaps, when the Trump administration was in full force a few years ago, we used to describe this as a bridge over troubled water. And perhaps we can bridge other troubled water together. We know we live in a time of very troubled waters indeed, and I know we all have a sense of what disability and what experiences in and with disability can contribute to bridge over those troubled waters. So the main trouble I'm facing now is we've got too much to tell you about. We're perhaps too enthusiastic about what we're going to say. Because this is not only on account of the enthusiasm of actually being here and having this opportunity, but in fact, we are at a time at our institute, which has been going on for over 20 years now. Somehow we founded the project, and the project has come to some maturity, so that it has a clear sense of what it's doing and why it's doing it. And this, as you will see, is very deeply related to issues of disability. So it's particularly important for us to have this dialogue. And that sort of revision of this 20-year history that we're currently conducting is really partly responsible for me having too much to say. So thank you for bearing with me, and I'll try to be as clear and articulate as possible. So we might frame this as a question, if we see the next slide. What would the following have in common? A blind photographer, an Institute of Critical Studies, a critical disability studies program, and a new social and economic alliance that we're slowly trying to get off the ground. So, what all of these might have in common, we might describe in a single term, which is one that we keep coming back to, and that is the term interpellation, to interpolate. And we often, Beatriz and I, we've been working together for many, many years now. We organized our first event, to which thankfully Susan here was present, as was Beth Jorgensen. And we've been explaining what interpellation might hold in store for disability in a way since then, and in my case from before as well. And we often are invited to talk about inclusion for reasons that you're well where. And we often find it interesting to contrast inclusion and interpolation, and to say even that they might be the opposite of each other and not simply complement of each other. And I would try to explain why. I will only be able to say so very briefly. To be more precise, I would say they are the reverse of each other, interpolation and inclusion. Not exactly the contrary, but the reverse. Okay? So why might this be? This all starts with an amazing you'll see some images here. This is a self-portrait of Eugen Baučák, who's a Slovenian blind photographer. He lost his two eyes in successive accidents. One of them was due to his curiosity. He found a mine which was left over during the Second World War. And he was a very curious young man, and he took a hammer and he started to strike to see what kind of an effect he could get. So he became blind, and he was then at school, and when he was 16 he was in love with a girl in his school, and he had this idea of taking a photo in sort of black. And he describes his first experience as something very, very powerful, very intimate that went on between him and this other person. And he then slowly began to have more and more photographic experience and undertakings. He would play pranks, like he would go to exhibitions at the Louvre. He then set them in France because he did a PhD there in aesthetics. And he would go on to the radio and talk about exhibitions. People became very curious, and then at some point he was invited to a jazz club, which is interesting, jazz club. And somebody saw his exhibition there, and the next year he was named the photographer of the month. The official photographer, of Paris Photography Month in 1988. So he became more and more known after that. And then he became a very prolific artist, a public intellectual, I'd say, and also a writer. And I ran across his work because I used to work in a school of design. And I used to teach theory, or I used to try to teach theory to graphic designers. And I found they had no interest whatsoever in what I had to teach them. So I one day found myself watching a film, perhaps you've come across it, it's called Proof, an Australian film where you have Hugo Weaving and a couple of other very famous, very young at the time, Australian actors. And there's this actor who's blind and who took photos when he was younger to find out whether his father lied to him about some particular thing. And he shows this photo to his friends and asks, what do you see in this image? Tell me. So I went back to the classroom and I said, from now on you will design for blind people. You will stop using the image as this sort of self-evident, transparent medium that you're sort of apparently familiar with. You can see this work, these other amazing photographs of Baučák's. They are online. I will provide web pages and so on if you're interested. So I want to stress that my original interest, I have no previous contact with disability as such, at least not apparently. I was very struck by what I then called the blindness to blindness that these students of mine had. They were sort of gung-ho sure that they could really see the world, and they couldn't see sort of shit, if you can allow my technical expression. So it was actually a very successful and very striking experience, so much so that I then went to the school sort of main office and I said, listen, we should establish a program of collaboration with the blind right here in the middle of this school design. So of course they said, you're crazy. And I came back a few months after that, showing them this work that you're seeing. And I said, listen, this is a blind photographer and you should be interested in this. And they said, yes, it's very interesting, but you're still crazy. So I then went and brought an exhibition of his to Mexico, and it was set up in a big photography museum, and then it toured the whole country, and it was a big scandal of sorts. It was all over the press and so on. And that was in 1999, and the topic really never left me after that, because it's obviously very productive in many, many kinds of ways. So, what is interesting about the blind photographer in this context is that, in fact, there is no very obvious inclusion of the blind photographer. The blind photographer does not ask for any permission to do what they do. In fact, he pisses other photographers quite a bit. They feel sort of, that not so much attention should be paid to this blind photographer, So of course he had an instructor who was, without prejudice, sort of introduced him to the art of photography and the use of the camera and so on. But beyond that, he really was in no way welcomed. He simply sort of opened his doors as he went along. So he sort of related his way as a blind photographer. So then, this is by now a 25-year history, and Mexico has become something of a powerhouse of blind photography because it got all sorts of effects going. I've even written a short listing of different projects that emerged after this and so on. Now, I am a psychoanalyst, I'm a Lacanian psychoanalyst, and I then became curious in relating a theoretical contribution that Lacan made. He described basically 4 types of social bonds. The discourse of the master, of the university, of the hysteric, and of the analyst. His contribution really had to do with figuring that psychoanalysis was a kind of sociality. It wasn't simply a therapy, it wasn't simply a method, which is the word Freud famously used. It was a whole form of relating and of creating instances of subjectivity and of basically putting into play factors that have to do with power and knowledge and subjectivity. Now, one can talk endlessly about this. There are some formulae on the screen. The point is that religion, politics, art, science, and psychoanalysis can all be thought of as forms of sociality, very distinctly. Politics and religion are a result of putting power in the center of the equation. Science, of course, puts knowledge in the center. Subjectivity sets off our subjective field and the aesthetic ranges of experience. And psychoanalysis really sets off from whatever it cannot be included by considerations relating to power, knowledge,
and nor even subjectivity. So psychoanalysis will basically deal with all the leftovers from those massive three other regimes, right? So let's say it deals with the nothingness that is left, and that still sort of affects our lives in various ways. The unconscious is a way of describing that, and this is something that you would be amply familiar with in terms of various strands of contemporary thought and so on. But the interesting thing is that it is possible for this nothingness, or for this residual sort of point of departure, residual with regard to power, knowledge, and subjectivity, to be the basis of a social form of bonding, right? That's what Lacan is saying in his description of psychoanalysis. So, I basically became interested in how this nothing, this residual element that I just named, could be related to the blindness in the figure of the blind photographer, right? And I basically proposed that it could be put that if psychoanalysis worked as the exploration of the effects of this interpolation in the subjective field by the residual, and that therapeutic processes really are about that, about exploring our being interpolated by a certain form of nothingness, if you will. One could think in terms of imagining that this interpolation could take place also in the field of knowledge and not simply of subjectivity, as Lacan describes. Now, this is actually very similar to what happens in deconstructive discourse and this deconstructive thought, let us say, writing. I'm thinking of Jacques Derrida specifically. So I basically came up with the idea that one might think of deconstruction itself as a form of sociality, yeah? Not as a method, not as a philosophy, but as a concrete set of relations, a matrix that could set off a series of social spaces, relations, possibilities. And I basically mapped out this description I've just attempted with the very figure of the blind photographer as a figure that somehow condenses this sociality. And I then went on to found the Institute, 17 Institute of Critical Studies, of which the blind photographer was really the founding sort of lighthouse type sort of reference figure. And it made a lot of sense because it was a statement about relating to negativity, like how it is that the blind photographer, can relate to the visual through indirect means, through memory, through conversation, and so on. Then, of course, you have many other blind photographers. He was really something of a pioneer of them, but there are many examples, and it's quite interesting to see how they work differently, each of them. So, the Institute was founded in 2001, and it was basically an experiment, something of a sort of fieldwork type experience, in trying to see both epistemologically, but also practically, administratively, economically, and so on, how it might be possible for this logic, let us still call it the logic of the blind photographer, to animate an institutional ethos and to guide an institutional strategy. So, as you know, founding an institution and managing an institution can be a very, it can be very boring at times, it can be very troubling at times, it can be very worrying at times. But in fact, if you think of it in terms of sort of a critical analytic type of field work, it actually becomes very fascinating because all the problems become instances that inform a wider discussion and so on. So we've been going at it for over 20 years now, and we founded the first postgraduate programs in critical theory in Spanish and certainly in Mexico. We have done some editorial work and some work with radio. We've done some consultancy, and we founded a Center for Advanced Studies. Our postgraduate programs have they've been going for 15 years now. They have a particular method. They've been set up to work online, in writing, in fact. So we interact with people from different parts of Latin America, beyond Mexico, and so on. And we have tutors coming in from all kinds of different places. It was quite in bad taste to set up an online program in the critical humanities in 2006. Now it's become something of a commonplace. Don't know exactly why, but we can talk more about that. And it's actually been a very rich experience. And then, lo and behold, in 2010, Beatriz and I met at a conference in Costa Rica. I was, of course, talking about the blind photographer, so she put her hand up and began to talk. And in fact, before that, she had a dream, but that's another story.
That is in the second question.
But the point is that I wanted to give you some sense of this context. Of course, I'm interested in underlining its logic and so on, but this is the context in which the program in critical studies in disability develops and has been developing basically since 2013. I didn't think of myself as working in the field of disability studies before meeting Beatriz, because I really wanted to make this reference as widely known as possible, and I feared that this would somehow sort of enclose me in a particular community. But on meeting, in fact, I was very happy to come in touch with many references that she made known to me, and so on. So now on to Beatriz, who will talk about the disability studies program and the project that has been developing through it.
Well, thank you so much for coming. I don't think I need the
No, I think it helps the
It
caption.
helps? Okay. Well, my accent, I don't know if it helps, but anyway.
Oh, it's
So-
lovely. You sound lovely.
Thanks. So let me tell you a little bit about our first event that was this colloquium in 2013. The colloquium had as a title, How Disability Puts Between quotation marks normality. So the idea was to invite people to rethink not only disability, but to rethink normality. And by that time in Mexico, there was little known about critical disability studies. Of course, there is a huge work that has been done in the area of activism regarding rights for education and health and even rehabilitation. But about the field of disability studies was very little known, and something was going on in Argentina, but not that much, and it was happening especially in the field of education. So when I came, I used to work, at that time I was working in the Netherlands in a program that was outside the field of disability, but somehow connected. It was about leprosy. But I met Benjamín, and then when I heard what he was doing at the institute, I immediately proposed him, why don't we start a program on disability studies, like little by little, since the institute it's a small institute and there is no bureaucratic work that we have to do in order to implement a program or even a research program. So that was the first event in 2013. Susan came, Beth Jorgensen, and many other people that we knew were doing some work either in England or maybe in the States. And actually a couple of people doing something in Mexico. So what happened after that is that little by little, people within the institute, the students who were doing postgrad programs on critical theory, started wondering about disability, like, is this related to medicine or to health? So we opened the first certificate on critical disability studies. Since then, we have been opening once every year. It lasts 8 months, and what we do is we have been changing every year the topic of the certificate. So the first program that we offer had seminars on the 4 discourses of disability that were the religious discourse, the scientific discourse, the discourse of arts and subjectivity, and the last one that was the critical discourse. So after that, and then this concept of interpellation, that is, I think that in English, interpellation, I don't know, it's not that common, right? It's not. We did a seminar last year with the British Council, and people coming from the UK were quite amused about the use of interpellation. Like, we needed to explain more about that use in Spanish, because interpellation in Spanish is more like questioning something, right? So I don't know in English, maybe that is this something that I don't know, we can discuss about, but interpellation in Spanish is disability, for instance, questioning what normality is about, or disability questioning what the rules that we have in the world about learning or even experiencing life are set up. So disability does that for us. So that is something we wanted to share in the Institute through the programs. So we have been using concepts like interpellation, dislocation, that is more like dislocation, I think, in English, and also lately intersectionality, that is more common, I think. And our programs are based on the dialogue with people with disabilities. So because the program is an online program, we have been able to contact the people from Argentina, from Colombia, from Spain, and that has been a rich way of understanding even disability from different contexts, and how even the same concept of interpellation, for instance, is understood in a different way in Colombia or in Ecuador, and that. And basically what we have been trying to do is more participatory action research. So that has been a bit difficult, since the government in Mexico, for instance, is not that kind on people developing research on social sciences or humanities. I think that that's happening around the world, right? So basically, we have these activities that have been done since 2013, but it's only by the end of 2017 that I moved to Mexico. And then we started, doing more colloquia, like the one in 2018 that was about art and disability. But what happened at that time was that arts connected to disability were understood more like in the field of art therapy. So we wanted to change that idea of the artist as somebody who's doing therapy, right? So so we asked in that colloquium about where is the artist, where is the creator, where is this person located or positioned in the field of, in the circuit of art in Mexico and in Latin America. So I'm quite happy to say that because of that event that lasted for 1 week, we were able to change somehow the perspective on arts and disability in Mexico. And we supported a collective that is called Discreantes, that means like those who be discreantes. Yeah, those who discreate. So they gave themselves this name, and they have been doing a lot of things together and inviting other artists that actually didn't consider themselves as artists, or even they didn't consider themselves as artists with disabilities. So that was quite nice. We started a debate about who is an artist with a disability, if they want to be identified like that, and so on. So after that, we have established the rule, more or less, that every colloquium that we develop in the Institute, that actually we have twice a year, will include activities regarding disability. So there is no way that an event in the Institute will happen without addressing the issue of disability. And then we have this, also the Institute has offered 2 honoris causa doctoral degrees, one to Eugen Bouchard, the blind photographer, and the other one to Eva Lenny, who is this Scottish, right? Scottish famous percussionist. So she came to Mexico in 2018, and actually that helped us to do more kind of activism regarding the interrogation that we had about the disabled artist or the artist with disabilities. And then we developed since then some projects. One is this one that Benjamín mentioned already, about there is in Mexico this famous group of deaf performers. It's a group of theater that is called Seña y Verbo, Sign and Verb. And they became quite famous in the last, 10 years. So they came together by an invitation of the Institute for that colloquium. They came together with an ensemble of contemporary music that is called Liminar. So we invite them to do a project together about what is the meaning of listening and sound and noise and everything related to music. What is the meaning that deaf people find and that musicians find working together with deaf artists? So you are listening, but you are listening this musician from the Liminar ensemble, and on the screen you will see this violinist and Eduardo, who is the director of the artistic director of this theater group, deaf theater group. So they have participated in 2 of the festivals that the University of Guelph has organized in the last 2 years. It's the Festival of the Improvisation, right? So that is one of the projects. The other one is this one that I mentioned already. Is a kind of platform that is inviting artists with disabilities from different countries in Latin America to come together and do whatever they want to do with their creativity. And one of the projects that they made was this one that is called a new understanding disability arts as a new methodology to contrast precarity. So they won a prize, and with that money they developed a video. It's a kind of documentary that is registering the work that during the pandemic they did with no money, with no support from the government or any other institution, so showing how precarity can be a source of creation, artistic creation. So actually during the next week they will be showing this documentary back in Mexico. And we published together last year with the British Council from Canada and Tangle Arts Gallery a compendium of interviews and actually articles written by artists coming from Canada, the UK, the United States, and different countries in Latin America, from Brazil, from Argentina, from Mexico, from Colombia. So this publication is available online, and you will find it in English as well as in Spanish. And let me tell you that this is the first publication that we have regarding arts and disability that has a critical perspective. We have done research about what has been published in Spanish about the link between disability and arts, and everything seems to be more medicalized, and also, more addressing education and therapy, but nothing really recognizing the power of creativity that comes from disability and arts. So we are quite proud of that, because after that we developed a seminar that was a long seminar together with the University of Mexico and the British Council over there, and it was about politics, performance, and disability. So again, we invited people from different countries in Latin America, artists and also professionals who work in the field, to discuss about concepts that were coming out, like inclusive arts or accessible arts. That these were concepts that were used in daily life by institutions and organizations, but really didn't have a meaning when you were going out with the artists and that. But also we wanted to discuss about these concepts that we have implemented in the field of art, like interpellation, right? And also questioning inclusion as well, because one of the things that we tried to do is to somehow negotiate that in the field of arts and disability, inclusion shouldn't be the main concept to discuss, but should be creation and production, artistic production, and how that can help to change society. And this one is this we created. So I published a book about the life of the 25 last patients who had leprosy in Ecuador, in the first leprosarium in Ecuador. And based on that book, theater director took the stories, and he did this beautiful piece of, it's a play, a theater play. And because that happened during the pandemic, it became a kind of, I don't know how to say it, like it's somehow like a movie, or it's somehow like a movie, but actually it's a theater piece, right? And so they show it during the pandemic online, but then later this year, last March, we had it in theaters in Mexico City. So this piece also has helped us to introduce the question about how disability is connected to other, I don't know, like concepts, for instance, leprosy, or I don't know, issues regarding mental health in this piece, and institutionalization, and so on. Yeah. So we also, as Benjamín mentioned, we also have these editorial and publishing project in the Institute. And some of the books that we have published connected to disability are The Blind Photographer, this one about leprosy. There is an interesting book that was published by an artist who considers herself as a disabled artist, but also she is intersex. So she published this beautiful book that is called El Libro Intersex, or El Libro Intersexual, or the Intersexual Book. Also we have one written by a poet. He is a poet with a physical disability, Ekiwa Adler, who writes in English and also in Spanish. We have another one that is, this is a lady who had the first doctoral degree in 17 Institute, and the book was about writing the body and how to write pain, or about pain, because she has a chronic illness herself. So it's a beautiful book. I don't see another one. Oh yeah, there is another book that his author died years ago. We didn't know him, but actually we came across his manuscript because of a friend, actually a relative of Benjamín. And this was a book. This gentleman had multiple sclerosis, but he did philosophy, and then he wrote this book about the connection between somehow spirituality, the body, and his disability. So he died, but the manuscript was there, so we decided to publish it because there is very little written about this connection between spirituality or theology and disability in Spanish. Thanks. So we have also developed some programs because we have our own radio station, let's say. So we did a program that was called Dislocations, and every Thursday we invited a person with a disability together with his or her family to talk about daily life. So it was kind of nice, you know, to have people from Argentina talking about what they do, how they do it, and then link to that how they manage all the difficulties in life regarding disability, but overall regarding, you know, the lack of support from governments and states and that. And the second part of the year, last year, 2021, we decided there is nothing, you know, there is a lot of done in Mexico regarding activism and disability since, I don't know, the 50s, 1950s or 1960s, but nothing registered as such. So we decided to interview the main representatives of these organizations, that comes from the 1960s and 1970s and that. So we are going to publish those interviews next year as a book. So it will be the first contribution actually to the history of the disability movement in Mexico. So we are quite excited about it. The nice thing about this is that we managed to do it as a radio program, but basically those interviews are there, so we are transcribing them and then editing, so that will be published next year. And thanks. Yep, so I think that there are many things that I would like to tell you about the future of the program, but maybe that will come in my second talk, and I will pass the microphone to Benjamín. So thank you so much for listening to the
Okay, so as you see, the adventure has been about deploying the logic of the blind photographer as a logic, and turning that into an institution that in turn allows various other projects to develop within it on its basis. Now, this has been done out of sizable amount of passion, not only, of course, our own, but of many, many other collaborators and students and people who've participated in many of these initiatives. But of course, the economic question is very obvious, right? So how do you actually sustain all of this? And in particular, how do you sustain a position that is inherently disruptive, that always wants to interpolate rather than simply mainstream back into what's considered obvious by the state or by the market or even by non-governmental grants and financing institutions and so on. Often they really align themselves with policies that might work from an official point of view, but not really from our own. How do you sustain economically, and how might it be possible to conceive of an economic proposition that might give solidity and strength to all of this? I wanted simply to mention, so as not to leave it pending, that of course what we're supposing is that the idea of inclusion is really much more related to what happens in the first three discourses, right? So in the discourse of power, or the discourse of knowledge, or the discourse of subjectivity, where basically disability and all these other critical elements that can work critically in society and in culture at large, they're sort of brought into the norm that is sort of naturalized in terms of power, in terms of knowledge, and in terms of aesthetics and forms of social and cultural relating. So after the earthquake of 2017, which was a pretty serious earthquake in Mexico City, we got involved by raising money, and we were surprised to find that we could raise some, not enormous, but for us important funding to aid the relief effort after the earthquake. And on spending this money, we found that in fact it's not so easy to spend money sort of intelligently, is it? Like making things happen where they need to happen at the time they need to happen. So the adventure then was trying to deploy the logic of the blind photographer in an economic arena, after all these other layers of experimentation and of investigation in various ways. So we came up with, we mejor las plataformas. We came up with this idea to build a platform, which is called Critical Switch. We built it over 4 years. We didn't want to get any external funding for this, so we only depended on our own resources for this. And it basically looks like a crowdfunding platform, except that it works at a logically previous level than what is usually the case in crowdfunding platforms. So it's not about, having somewhere you can deposit funds, to a particular end, but it actually brings the original communities of interest together that will then make possible to look for the resources necessary to complete whatever project might be, on the program. So the idea is that any of us here, if you want to go if you want to go build a crazy institute, you sort of say, I want to build a crazy institute, and maybe other crazy people will say, oh, that sounds like something that I might be interested in, so, let's talk, and we get a dialogue going, and then you say, well, I have these resources, I'm clear about these issues, but I'm needing these other elements. So, people begin to be able to find their place in this equation, and what is originally a proposal turns into an actual initiative. So this all happens on the platform, and the platform is built in a way that is very flexible. Its main objective is, of course, not to make a profit, as is the case in usual crowdfunding platforms, but actually to allow for these disruptive projects to take off in the first place and to survive, as they go along. So we're in the process of finishing the financial infrastructure for this to work, and basically we are trying to materialize this vision of what I might dare to call an interpellative economy, that is interpellative in the sense that it goes beyond the usual canons and expectations, both related to the state and to the market, and, as I said, to foundations and other grant-making sort of mainstream-ish bodies. And once you have, these communities built around certain initiatives, and if it works and it takes off, you will all be, enthusiastically invited to take part in this if you so wish. But once you have all these particular communities around certain initiatives, then of course you have the collection of all of these communities that can come together and be clear about the importance of an alliance that allows this wider sort of social fabric to come together. So in a sense, I'm obviously very excited about it because it's a very clear sort of literalization of this idea of the social bonds that we began with. And ahora sí las otras opciones. So in order to facilitate these processes, we have a floating market, so-called, which is basically an exchange where goods and services will be able to be put, to the public view for people to purchase and exchange with the products that are associated with these initiatives that I described, and also allow this collection of communities to become something of an economic alliance as a whole, right? So that they will be able to negotiate certain better pricing or certain facilities with different providers of services and so on, And this is really addressing the precarity, the word Beatriz mentioned, that we face in Latin America today, where support, for example, in Mexico, which was traditionally quite strong for the arts, is definitely waning, and where we really need to have an alliance of this kind in order to be able to be relatively self-sufficient and stand on our own feet. The last of the three platforms is a social network, where you can meet like-minded people and build, various forms of dialogues and exchange with them in order to nourish this social fabric as a whole. So this is the current stage that we're in. We hope to be able to fund many of our own initiatives through this, and also, as I said, to open up this platform for other projects and other organizations to be able to fund their own and to somehow promote this wider alliance. From a fieldwork perspective, this instance is the current sort of space for experimentation and for clarification, conceptual and practical, to see, in fact, how far we can go in taking this logic to the economic arena. So I think that rounds off this presentation by both of us. It would be great to be able to talk with, and thank you very much. Would you like some coffee and we talk after the coffee?
Right here.
Yeah.
Should we pass the mic, maybe?
Sure.
Might be good.
It's on the stand.
Thank you. That was great, Beatriz and Benjamin. I want to just talk a little bit, Benjamin, about this idea of the blind photographer and the logic of blind photography. It seems to me that on one level, maybe a surface level, photography is the creation of images of something, and photographer, whether blind or not, seems to be involved in that creativity, and even in the thing being the image of the thing being photographed. It kind of reminds me of Lacan's the imaginary, where whatever we're in a sense looking at as photographers, we need to imagine that as an image and not as a thing that we're looking at. So this is just a confusing way of saying the fascinating thing with the blind photographer is that the process of image creation seems to be the thing that might be disturbing to either other photographers who aren't blind and to those people who see the notion of blind photography as an oxymoron, as something that blind people, I don't necessarily mean shouldn't do, but if they do very, very poorly. So it's kind of an interesting phenomenon to me of the imagined thing to be photographed, and then to photograph that image. So that was just a comment, Benjamin. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I completely agree with your description, and I thought as I heard you that what those other photographers were blind to their own blindness. What they find disturbing is that somehow they're forced out of the closet by the blind photographer because the what's at stake in their person, in their work, is suddenly sort of visible to everyone, for the exact reasons you described. So, in fact, there is a clear reason why the blind photographer is disruptive and very unsettling, personally and socially. And the irony of it, of course, is that what's unsettling is that in the end, photographers who are blind to their own blindness work as if their own personas were not at stake in their work. There's this sort of objectification of these images, which is why really the blind photographer is the paradigm of photographers in general. And I even thought that the self-portrait of the blind photographer, which is a very paradoxical image, insofar as the blind photographer cannot see the result of their self-portrait, can only imagine it. This image would be in some way the paradigm of all images in general, insofar as all images are blind self-portraits of the photographers taking them. So I'm simply trying to play along with your suggestion and see how far we can go with it. Boucher says something really beautiful about his images. He says, the originals are in my mind. So it's not that I don't see them, it's that what you're seeing is simply the copy of what I see. And it's probably not a very good copy of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Thank you, Benjamín and Beatriz. And I actually have a sort of a follow-up question to Rod's question, but maybe continuing the conversation. And I guess it's perhaps slightly a provocation, but I remember, when you were, Benjamín, when you were talking about the responses to blind photography and sometimes the discomfort of the sighted photographers or the general public. And I think I remember reading in the Mexican newspaper, maybe a decade or two ago, about blind photography, and some of the responses to Gerardo Mijenda's work, right, which is a fairly well-known blind photographer in Mexico, and the one sort of very critical view said something like, it's like a spectacle. It's a circus phenomenon. Come and see the blind photographer, right? So I was curious about that kind of the objectification of this blind photographer is kind of it's almost a freak figure, right? And that the more perhaps elite sphere of conventional or in quotes the normal photographers are uncomfortable and yet maybe fascinated by it, right? How do they do that? So I guess I was wondering about the sort of that perception or perhaps risk of objectification of the blind photographer, right? Given that, a moment ago I think you were talking about the sort of potential, of objectification of the image, right? And whether how we see the image as an object or as something in the mind and how that dynamic works. And so then I'm wondering too about the image of the persona of this blind photographer that in some spheres becomes that object of fascination. If that makes sense. Thanks.
Of course, it's definitely a liability, let's say. But I think the interesting thing is that it only is a liability when you keep to a very crude and in fact conceptually unsustainable idea of what sight is about. Because as Rod was very careful to say in his wording, the apparent, you said oxymoron, right? It's only apparently a contradiction that a blind person should be able to photograph. And it's only apparent insofar as, in fact, blind spots are constitutive of the photographic apparatus itself, as is the case, for sight as such. So you need to blink, once in a while to begin with, and there's many other layers of this example. So in fact, it's an ideology, right? Very clearly, and you see it in relation to how the whole imaginary of photography and the photographer works around sort of an ableist ideal of sightedness and so on. So when somebody pokes fun at you, and it's happened often, yes, okay, so you're a blind photographer and you're a deaf percussionist, and so who's next, and it's only when you can really convey that sight itself is partially blindness, because if not, it would not even occur, that you can get out of that trap. It's really a trap, and its nature as a stereotype really has to do with that entrapment that I'm trying to get at.
I'd like to add something that is more, it has to do more with what Benjamín explained. Mexico became this sort of mecca of the blind photographers, and the thing is that once it was rejected because of all these reasons that you were talking about, then immediately the market saw this as a way of producing something with that, right? So you have many, there is even one lady who is involved in the business and that, and she was very smart and did this training to blind people. So now she has this kind of school of blind photographers, but that sells even blind dinners. So these photographers become a kind of clowns who are playing around with food and these kind of things, and then the funny thing is that because she's linked to this, she's the daughter of a great businessman back in Mexico, she has been able to sell the idea that this is okay. So she goes around the world making money with that. She goes with these blind photographers and blind waitresses to Davos, the meeting in Davos, and bringing, it's Davos, right? Yeah, in the last one in Norway or something. So she get a lot of money out of that. So we have been talking with Benjamín how this, how the system is so smart in getting all these ideas about something that is rejecting, the system is rejecting people with disabilities, is looking at the margins, but at the same time, whenever there is the opportunity of making, of producing something with that, immediately they include, between quotation marks, they include people with disabilities, but not in the way that they will be seen, but that they will produce, right? So we have been so critical about this kind of production because it's connected to arts And we have seen how, for instance, there is a school of Down syndrome artists producing the same. It's like there is a pattern there, right? That the artists with Down syndrome only produce angels or flowers, or they just paint wherever the society is saying you should paint as an artist with Down syndrome, right? So it's the same with the blind photographer, and now we are facing this other project that is about, you know, this dialogue between musicians and deaf actors, artists. Sorry, and the thing is that we had so many people saying, "Oh yeah, that is not new, right? There are so many projects around the world where deaf people are taught to listen to music, for instance, but actually our idea is not that one. Our idea is to question how we understand listening, for instance, or to question how the body becomes a big ear, right? And how we don't understand that the listening comes from beyond the ears, or so that part, I think that it will, you know, we will spend some years more in this lab regarding music and deafness, and then suddenly we'll see it as a productive tool, and something will happen in the market. So it comes like that. It's really interesting how something that is freak or considered freak can be included because it produces money, actually, right? So yeah, it's quite interesting to discuss about that, but very little is done over there. So we are quite happy every time that we can manage to open those spaces for this kind of discussions that are needed. Yeah. So,
thank you. There's a question from Carolina.
Yeah, it's try to frame it as a question, because I have more of a constellation of ideas, kind of following up on Rod's question and your answer and everything that we've been discussing. But it reminded me, of course, of Derrida's Memoirs of the Blind, and then I was thinking about this trajectory from the Critical Institute, right, to a disability. Is it Disability Institute as well? No, it's a program. It's a program within. But how you know, the framing of the trajectory of a critical institute that has the blind photographer as the main figure to founding a disability program within it, talks a little bit about disability as the possibility of critique itself, or as a figure of critical studies, or a figure of deconstruction. I don't know if you would agree with that. Just listening to you, it kind of takes me back to that place. And also like how at the same time that is a figure for critical thought and it allows for a lot of practice and bringing other people that becomes kind of a way of that is not therapeutic, that is about knowledge, but also how would you frame that other. What does disability then brings to the Critical Studies Institute in this sense? Is it the same thing because it helps think about what critical studies is and how critique is possible? Or, how does it fit within the institute frame?
That is a great question, because again, like this concept that we use in Spanish, it's when you think about how disability questions or critiques normality, it comes with that, right, with the interpelación that. But that has happened even within the institute, because, for instance, the platform that we use that we have been using since 2006 for the postgrad programs. Everything is about writing. We do it because, as Benjamin was explaining, there is no tradition on writing essays in Spanish. So we can build these long sentences that could be 1 page long without commas or So something that the institute we have been trying to do is to practice writing, because that helps also to reflect more on what we are trying to do, right? Like when you are going to write, of course you pay attention to what you are doing, but with the program on disability studies, we needed to rethink about that, because we had blind people coming to the program, and sometimes, because this is a certificate, it's not a master's program yet, so we invite people, who haven't finished college or university or even high school, that they can come and be part of the program. But then you encounter these discussions about why it's not accessible for disabled people who haven't finished education, for instance, like higher education, or why it's not accessible for deaf people. So it has questioned also the idea of critical studies in that way, like what does it mean to be a critical institute, or how we are connecting praxis with these reflections on critical theory, for instance, right? So the interesting part is, I don't know how it works, I know how it works in big universities, for the time I work in those universities, but in the Institute, since 2013, we have seen a change happening in the other areas, like gender studies or the critical theory program, thinking more about disability. How is that connected to other issues and not only to the body, for instance, right? How we understand the world. And so now you see, every time that we talk about disability, we have every Tuesday meetings with the coordinators of the areas. There are people thinking about it, like there is one area on territorial studies, or studies of the territory. So this person is an architect, and he has been thinking about how the cities are built, and how that responds to an ableist way of thinking architecture, right? Or there is suddenly a lady who's doing studies on cyclism. My English is cycle studies, or cyclism or cyclist?
Cycling, like bicycle?
Cycling.
Okay.
Cycling, yeah. So we are doing that. So she's like, oh my goodness, there are people with disabilities on the street, and I never thought about that, like how even the bicycles can be obstacles for people with disabilities on the streets. Anyway, so I think that it takes time, but somehow it's becoming a way of interrogating our own work. And even I have seen Benjamín changing somehow a little bit his discourse about the 4 discourses of Lacan, based on what I guess we have been discussing about critical disability studies. So yeah, it's actually a challenge that we have at the Institute ourselves. Yeah, so thanks.
It is a very interesting question. And I think Beatriz has pointed to various things that I will say in a different vocabulary. I think what it does is it really questions the vessel that sustains you while you work with critique. So, to be strict, yes, blindness in this case is a figure of deconstruction, and the experiment consists in saying, okay, let's think of, you know, gender and the environment and other like locations of trouble as figures of deconstruction and see how far that can take us. And we know in theory that can take you very, very far. The problem is that when you do that in universities, like in the usual sort of way, it takes you much less further than it might. So I didn't go into this, but when we contrast interpolation and inclusion, in fact the contrast is very stark, and you can see this in two ways. When you think of Lacan's university discourse, what it does, it sort of repeatedly gestures to include the residual, right? So it's always incorporating. One supposes by wanting to build the Babel Tower of absolute knowledge, right? Until there's nothing left and the big fat man is satisfied and that's it, yeah? That's the meal. Whereas what we're talking about here is in fact exactly the contrary. The residual interpolates knowledge, which is not exactly what Lacan says, because he talks about savoir, not connaissance. But anyway. So, in fact, we're talking about, I mean, deconstructive discursivity is exactly the opposite of what Lacan describes as university discourse. And nowadays I'm not so happy with this name, because we now have this creature called post-truth. But a few years ago we used to, and I still call it that because that was the original denomination, that's contrary sort of vectorization of university discourse we have called the post-university. So the idea is that the Institute of Critical Studies operates as a post-university, and I think disability, what it does is that it really massively questions the university, as we, I think, know. And I think the biggest challenge is to be able to work with critique and with deconstruction radically enough in order for its effects to be able to be felt and not to be constrained by the institutional equation, if you see what I mean. So the reason why it's been interesting to build an institution as such is to follow the question as far as we can. You know, under what conditions might you be able to sustain this work, making sure that the institution itself will not stop the movement that is created in these local projects, yeah? Now, that has, I think, very far-reaching consequences. You mentioned Derrida's Memoirs of the Blind. It's a wonderful reference. And I think the consequences go, in all of this, go as far as allowing us to wonder whether conceiving of deconstruction as a social bond and not simply as the space of the university without condition can in fact take us further away into society than the figure of the university as such allows us to do. So the question is, deconstruction as a social bond clearly reaches beyond the university. I've explained why in terms of Lacan's discourse of the university. And I think that's important because it allows us to, you know, get involved in economic systems and practices of all sorts
and many very embodied disability-related practices of the kinds that we might be able to illustrate in various ways amongst us, and that clearly allows you, I think, to go beyond, not in relation to critique itself, but in relation to the context in which critique is cultivated nowadays. And that, if I can just add briefly two more things, brings in praxis in a way that theory doesn't usually do, which is a catastrophe, of course. I mean, university-based theory is like, like an instruction sheet to go somewhere very far, but in fact you might be missing the actual mechanism with which to get there, right? So it can be very, very sophisticated, but end up being completely predictable in its consequences. And that is something that disability teaches us very clearly is not the way to go, one. And two, it's gone. Two, it allows you to think of a style of critique that is not simply about critiquing, but about creating. And that has everything to do with disability. Because you still have to solve the thing at the end of the day, right? You can go back and forth in the domain of ideas and so on, but you still need to get there. And that is something that is very eloquent to me as a psychoanalyst, because I have a practice as an analyst. And therefore, I'm very unsatisfied with highfalutin theory that doesn't go anywhere, really, or that is simply sort of academic, even though I have nothing against that either. But this element of practice and of what I call institutive deconstruction, instead of subject-producing, sort of empowering critique, I think that's very important, and I think it's an emphasis that is brought by the singularity of disability as a figure of deconstruction, which somehow allows you to go beyond theory in the usual sense in university contexts.
My name is Chloe Atkins, and I do work on disability as well, health equity and disability and employment. So I've been very interested in economics and disability. Sorry, is that better?
Yeah.
I wanted to return to the question of objectification and the idea of spectacle, because if there's something that around the blind photographer and Elspeth Glennie, many people, I suspect, don't know that she's deaf when she performs, that there is sort of this duality. She's a deaf percussionist. And anybody with a disability, if you wheel into a room and everybody looks at you, there is a spectacle that happens when you're disabled, that you become a spectacle. And that balance between the quotidian life, the normal life, and one of the things I sort of worry about is I myself have used a wheelchair. I have an episodic disability, and that sort of sense of spectacle that happens when other people look at you. And then you perform extraordinarily. You're a blind photographer, you're a professor, or whatever that is. And it doesn't, what I worry about is it doesn't capture the mundaneness of what it is to be human, and that we all deal with little incapacities and disabilities with our environment, the interaction all the time. And so that it becomes this exception that we make an allowance for, like, oh wow, look at Stephen Hawking. I even do this, right? And say, wow, wasn't he extraordinary? And yet, there is a creativity to a disabled life that actually doesn't have economic activity, that manages to live a life that is just as valuable as one that is as spectacular as the blind photographer. And I'm wondering whether you can address that, because one of the things I feel sometimes as a person with a disability is that aspect of spectacle that makes me very uncomfortable.
I think that is really good that you raised that issue, because, for instance, And within the certificate that we have, we always include within the seminars, like we have instructors or professors who are both disabled and non-disabled. And one of the main things that we invite the students, for instance, to discuss is about these regular issues that seems they seem to be more locked in a room, right? Like the other day we were talking with two mothers of children with disabilities who are following the course, and one of them said, this is the only place where I can really say, I wish I wouldn't have a child with a disability. She said, otherwise, when we are with the other mothers of the rest of the children, it's impossible to say it because immediately you are judged as a bad mother, or what kind of mother are you, right? So I think that is linked to what you said, because there is also feelings of not accepting what we are, or all these issues that are mundane, as you said, and that happens every day. Like, we try to raise these issues in the certificate, for instance, or every time that we come across a project, thinking about daily life, like how is to be a person with a disability in daily life, and how is to be a relative of a person with a disability in daily life. How sometimes you hate. I talk of myself as a sister, for instance, right? Sometimes I hate to be involved in this family because it's too much. And there is no way that some people will listen to that and say, you're right, it's too much. You always have to be this great and strong sister, right? So we are always trying to see disability as this potential, but also the other side of disability, the side of, there is suffering as well. There is, especially in environments like the ones that we work with in Mexico, for instance, there is a lot of poverty. There is, we try to say, because we sometimes with the people with disabilities that we gather at least once a month to discuss about these things. Some of them said, no, we don't use the word people with disabilities. We use the word people with different capabilities. That is something that sometimes they use. And there is somebody saying, no, come on, I have a disability, and I would like to be recognized as that, because I suffer sometimes because I cannot see something, because this city is not made for people, for blind people. So we struggle with that. So we need to talk about that as well, like these two, the two sides of the coin, right? So, but there is a lot that tends to be shown in that way, as you said, these superheroes, and yeah, we are not in that direction. And actually, we try to discuss more about these topics that, as Benjamín said, are residuals, like are left, even in the field of disability, are left behind. So I think that, for instance, one of those is about spirituality, that I have been more involved lately, because in countries like Mexico, 70% of the families are believers, are religious, they attend churches. But sometimes there is this kind of rejection from the academia to talk about that. Like, no, because that means that we are going to get into this discourse that disabled people are these divine people or something like that, right? So we are very aware of that, and we have been also doing things against actually to that kind of discourse, right? And as you said, trying to understand disability more as a channel to understand life and to understand how to live in this world. Yeah.
I'm completely with you. I would say that the spectacular sort of impression of these examples has to do with them being thought of by us as pieces to deploy into the public eye, and therefore it's all about, you know, symbols and references and so on. But I'm absolutely with you, and I would say that of course what happens day to day in the analyst's office is exactly in that sort of domain of the daily and the small but the massive for us each. And also, and this allows me to pick up on the underlining that I suggested when I spoke about the jazz club that Boucher was first exhibited in, because I think the field of improvisation, which is of absolute daily occurrence in all of our lives, but very particularly also in the lives of anyone living with disability. Improvisation is always small and it's always magical in its, even if it's tiny. And I think that dimension I fully recognize is really probably the most important anyway. So thanks for pointing that out. So I suggest we have some coffee and I don't know, maybe rejoin in about 15? I don't know.
Maybe
10?
10 minutes?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Beatriz still wants to share some thoughts. That's the reason. Thank you.